Hello, I'm Heidi Manicherry. I'm one of the teachers of the Deaf for SEND Success, and this is a webinar about using radioaids. So the aims of the session today are to look at what a radioaid is and what it does, why it's important for use for hearing impaired pupils in the classroom, what occasions you would use it, how to use it, and we're going to do some troubleshooting as well at the end. So what is a radioaid? So a radioaid is a device that's frequently used in schools for pupils with a hearing impairment, and it helps them hear their teachers and other students better. And that's because it reduces the background noise that a pupil will hear and increases the volume of the teacher's voice or student voice or whoever's using the radioaid. And it's a really helpful way of supporting students in the classroom to hear what's going on and not be distracted by background noise. So how do radioaids work? They consist of two key parts. So the transmitter, and that's the picture on the left hand side, and this is the part that is worn by the speaker. So whether that's a teacher or a student, it's worn around their neck on a lanyard, and it should sit around 10 to 15 centimetres from the speaker's mouth. So really quick way to check is just to use your kind of hand span. That should measure around 10 to 15 centimetres. The other part is attached directly to the student's device and that's the picture on the right hand side. So this is a hearing aid picture and a receiver, but also we do have a couple of students who have these on cochlear implants as well. They look very similar. But the receiver is just the kind of small silver box that you can see right at the bottom of the hearing aid. That's the receiver, and it just clips into place, clicks into the bottom of that hearing aid onto something called a shoe. Now, the receivers are really small, about kind of a centimetre cube. So they are, very small, and recommend that they are kept kind of in school overnight. Put on as soon as the student comes in the morning and then taken off before they go home. And this is because they are quite expensive. So each receiver costs around £500. So if they do get lost, it costs a lot of money to replace them. And obviously they're very easy and small to lose. So we really recommend you find somewhere very safe in school to store them and have a key person who is kind of in charge of taking them off and putting them on at the beginning and the end of the school day. Another thing we recommend is having just kind of a poster up, because before, if they've been dropped, obviously if a cleaner comes along and finds it, they're not going to think it's anything important. So just having a poster, which should be able to download on our website, just to show people what they are. If you find this receiver, please put it somewhere safe, because it's a really key bit of equipment. So yeah, that's the receiver, and it just clips into place on the radio aid, which we'll talk a little onto the hearing aid, which we'll talk a bit more about in a moment. So a hearing aid wearer might find it difficult to hear speech for a number of reasons. The first is unwanted background noise. Classrooms can be really noisy places. If there's lots of just people moving around, not necessarily even talking, shuffling, doing the Velcro on their shoe, if there's just general background noise, it can be really difficult for someone who wears a hearing aid to filter this out and to concentrate on the person talking. Sometimes, even if there's no background noise, but the room has really poor acoustics, so for example, very high ceilings, lots of hard surfaces like big church halls or big Victorian classrooms can be really bad for hearing aid users, and that's because the sound just bounces around and reverberates, and even a small amount of noise can make it really difficult for someone with a hearing impairment to listen. Distance is really key. So most hearing devices will only pick up on speech if if the person talking is 1 to 2 meters away. So any greater distance than this, they won't be able to hear clearly, sounds will be lost, and it'll be really difficult for them to listen. And if you're not able to look at the person's face, people who use hearing aids and have cochlear implants are using lots of cues from your face. So looking at lip patterns, looking at facial expressions. If your face is covered up, or for example, you're having to turn to write on the board quite frequently, or moving around the room, and they're not able to see your face clearly, they will miss out on key information. So that makes things really difficult. So why is a radio aid necessary in the mainstream classroom? So we just talked about some factors that make it really difficult to hear speech, and lots of these are present in the mainstream classroom. So as we mentioned, background noise, there's lots of students moving around. Also just the noise of people shutting doors, coming and going, people shuffling about can create lots of noise, which makes it really difficult for people with a hearing impairment to listen. What a radio aid does is changes the ratios of the sound, so it reduces the background noise and increases the teacher voice. So they have a direct input from that teacher's voice to their hearing aids, so none of the information is lost, and they're able to filter out that background noise much easier and listen to the person who is talking. It helps in lots of different teaching situations. Obviously, we think of the mainstream classroom firstly, but obviously there's kind of assemblies and PE sessions, which we'll come on to in a moment. And it just helps with that distance that we talked about. So obviously, especially at the moment, we're required to kind of try and keep our distance where possible, and the recommendation is usually 1 to 2 meters, which is the distance that hearing devices aren't very effective at picking up sound. So they help a lot for our students because of all of these key factors. So when would you use a radio aid? So a radio aid should be used at any kind of key teaching time, so any carpet sessions, any time where the student is required to listen to the teacher talking. Obviously, when you're teaching a session, you might well do a bit of talking and then maybe move to kind of partner work. And we'll talk you through how you can do that really successfully with a radio aid. As I mentioned before, assemblies are a really important learning time, and there's a huge distance, which is why a radio aid is really helpful. Radio aids can also be used in kind of focus or partner work. So, for example, if the student's just working just with one other student, we'd advise giving the transmitter, so the device that's worn around the teacher's neck, to the student, so that the child with a hearing impairment is able to hear their partner really clearly. PE is a time where there's lots of movement, people running around a room, distances are changing all the time, so there's lots of background noise, so that's a really key time. And safeguarding there as well, just to keep them safe, just so they can hear instructions about when to stop moving. And so it's really important they are able to hear well in those sessions. Any class discussions, if it's small kind of table work, we sometimes recommend just, if the students are really sensible and they just pass it around, they don't need to constantly be putting it on their neck. If they hold it a sensible distance from their mouths, they might be able to, they're able to pass it around the group. Or if different people are asking questions, maybe passing the mic between students can be really useful. Things like phonics, where the student really needs to have that clear signal from the teacher to their ears, so that's a really important time. And also the radio aid is able to connect, it's able to plug into the whiteboard, because sometimes pupils find it really difficult to listen to the interactive whiteboard, any videos or anything you might play. Because the sound can be quite distorted, that can be really difficult to pick up. So if you can plug your radio aid in, that means they've got a much better chance of understanding and what's being said. And if you're unsure how to do this, please do let us know, we can come and show you. So there's two main types of radio aids that we use in Waltham Forest. The first is the Phonak Rogers touchscreen, and the second is the Phonak Rogers, and we're going to have a look at both of those today, just to run through a few of the basic functions. So this is the Phonak Rogers touchscreen. It's quite small, kind of size of a small mobile phone. It's quite light, should sit quite comfortably around the teacher's neck, so there shouldn't be any concerns around that. And we really try and encourage our students that they do look really discreet. They're not something that would make them personally stand out, having a radio aid. Especially when students move to secondary school, they're often quite reluctant to have anything that makes them kind of stand out, or their highlights their kind of difficulties. But yeah, we just really try and encourage students that it's something the teacher wears. There's not really anything they can notice on their hearing devices at all. So yeah, we'd really try and encourage that. So if you can too, that's great. So firstly, to just check that the hearing aid is working, because obviously if their hearing aid isn't working, not only will the radio aid not work, but they won't be accessing much at all in school. So that's just a thing to check kind of all the time. Firstly, to check the batteries. If there's any concerns, speak to parents, speak to us. We really want to make sure that students are wearing their hearing aids and they are working. The next thing to do is to attach the receivers. As I mentioned before, they just click into place. So when we set up a radio, we show you how that is, but it's a very clear click. It should be a very secure kind of sounding, reassuring noise as well that goes with that, to know that they are secure and in place. And we recommend having a key adult to do that every day. Or the student might be able to do it if they're old enough. The next thing to do is to switch on the transmitter, and on this device the on-off button is actually just to the side. It can't really be seen very well in this picture, but it's just on that top right corner just to the side. So just hold that in, it should be quite obvious when it turns on. To connect the transmitter to the receivers, there is on the touch screen at the bottom there's the connect button, and that needs to be held up to both receivers. So you would press the connect button on the transmitter, and then you'd hold it up to the receiver, and it should say it's connected. And then you need to repeat the process for the other ear if they've got two receivers. It should be quite clear, it kind of has a tick, and then it says it's connected if it has connected. If it hasn't, it will give you like an error message, and we'll talk about that in a minute. If it isn't successful the first time, it's always worth just trying again, just to try and get that connection. But we'll talk about the troubleshooting if you really can't get that. And the other functions at the top there, we can come and talk to you about if you would like to know more about them, but they're something that we don't use every day. So this is the Phonak Rogers. It's a very similar device, but just looks slightly different because it doesn't have that large touch screen. So again, check the radio is working, attach the receivers. To switch on, there's actually a sliding button with this one at the top. You can just see it as a little kind of bump there at the top. You just need to pull that across, and it should be quite obvious it should light up and turn on. Exactly the same in terms of connecting the transmitters. As you can see, the connect button is at the bottom there. So you just need to, just next to the kind of the screen on the right hand side, so you just need to press that button and connect to each receiver, and you should get a message to say it's connected. So yeah, they're very, very similar devices. They just look slightly different, but they all have exactly the same kind of functions. So if you followed that process and you can't seem to get the radio aid to work or can't get it to connect, we'll just run through a few things that you can try. So the radio aid needs to be charged overnight, every single night, so it has enough power in it to work the whole day. So we recommend that's just a habit you get into, just plugging it in before you go home at the end of the day, and it needs to have a certain amount of power to work. So you might be able to turn it on, but you can't get any connections, and if you look at the battery and it's very low, it might just need to be charged for it to work. The next thing to do is the battery on the hearing device, so on the child's hearing aids. Sometimes the hearing aid might be working fine, there's no issues with the battery, but it needs a certain amount of charge within the hearing aid battery for it to be able to connect to the radio aid. So we recommend if it's not connecting, it might be worth just changing the hearing aid batteries and just to see if that makes a difference. Next, check the student's hearing device is connected to the radio using a secret word. So if the child's saying they can't hear you, they don't think it's working, a really quick way to check, as I mentioned before, is just to get them to go out the room, just talk to them, to give them a secret password, and then see if they've heard that. Because sometimes students will say, oh, it's not working, because they can't really, when they're in front of you, can't really work out what they're hearing through their hearing aids, what they're hearing through the radio aids. So sometimes just checking if they're saying it's not working, just to see if it is. And as I mentioned before, just making sure that distance is right. It's not, if it's too far down, the microphone won't be able to pick up your voice. So yeah, just checking it's that 10 to 15 centimeters. So when you're using a radio aid, it's quite kind of straightforward. Once it's on and it's working, the child's able to hear your voice. So we recommend just teaching as you normally would. However, there are a few key things you need to remember when you're using it. And the first is to make sure that you repeat other students' comments. So as I mentioned, the way a radio aid works is by giving the student a direct signal to your voice and by reducing the other sounds. So that means if you're asking kind of the group a question and a child maybe at the back, quite far from them, answers, because the radio aid has pushed down those sounds, they're not going to be able to hear that student. So it's really important that you repeat those comments or questions that the other students are having so that they aren't missing out on those learning experiences. Sometimes it might be appropriate to pass it round, but sometimes if it's just a quick student question, it might just be easier just to repeat it. Mute. So the mute button is a very key part that you should really familiarise yourself with on the radio aid, on the transmitters, sorry. On the touchscreen, it's a very big button on the front that when you press it, it flashes, and it's less obvious on the Phonak Roger. But just familiarise yourself with that button, because what's really important is you use that button as soon as you are no longer talking directly to the class or to that student. So for example, if you were doing some teaching and then you went to speak to another student who had a question, you'd want to make sure that you press that mute button. And what that does, it completely stops the radio aid from working. The child's hearing device will switch back to what it was doing before. And they no longer have that direct connection with your voice. It's just a real habit to get into pressing it and to making sure you've done it, and then remembering to unmute it as well when you go back to teaching. It might be worth trying to get your class sometimes to kind of recognise when they see that flashing button to alert you, because it can be really easy to forget. And sometimes the child with a hearing impairment won't always say something because they don't want to stand out and they don't want to be different. So getting your kind of class used to doing that is really useful. Always switching it off when you're not using it. So the mute button should be used kind of when you're in a lesson, but for example, if they're going out to play at lunchtime, it's really important that you completely switch it off. This will help save the battery, and also means that when they're outside with their friends, they're not listening to what's happening in the classroom, and they can travel quite a far distance. So it is possible that the child's in the playground but actually listening to your chat with another teacher over lunch. So yeah, just make sure that that's happening. We mentioned phonics before, but that's obviously a very key, important time for pupils to have the best listening environment. So use quiet space and make sure the radio is being used. And just with the receivers, I know we talked about their expense before and how important they are. So it's really making sure that when you put them into place, that you feel and hear that click, which means that they are securely in place. And once you hear that, there shouldn't be any issues with them falling off. So it's just really getting used to that feeling and making sure that they are secure. Thank you so much for listening to this webinar today. We have other articles and some resources which would support kind of this webinar really. A printed sheet which kind of has an A4 sheet which has kind of the key things to remember about using a radio aid, and also, as I mentioned, the poster that would help to alert staff if a receiver ever got lost, what to look for, so everyone knows what that is. That's all on our website, as well as lots of other useful resources. If you have any questions or would like to get in touch, please do. Our email and phone number is below. Thank you.